In the fog-shrouded wilderness of Minnesota, where pine trees grow so thick they swallow sound itself, there once stood a settlement that vanished in a single night of fire and screaming. November 1893. The lake lay still as black glass, reflecting nothing but the orange glow that consumed everything sacred and profane alike. Neighbors from distant farms would later swear they heard a church bell melting, its bronze voice warping into something that sounded almost human, almost pleading. But this was not just any fire, this was not just any church. According to the surviving testimony of one witness, the Chapel of the Sacred Blood had been feeding on its own congregation for years, a machine of flesh disguised as salvation. The records speak of deathbed confessions, of ledgers that detailed horrors beyond comprehension, of a communion that demanded more than wine and bread. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe so you don't miss the truths history tried to bury beneath bureaucratic reports and convenient accidents. The official story claims two sisters, Esther and Ruth Crow, burned their father's church in an act of madness, consuming him and 37 souls in righteous flame. But to understand why two preachers' daughters would become executioners of the faithful, we must descend into the doctrine that turned salvation into slaughter. This was not just crime, this was an operation that fed on human lives for decades, and it took fire to end what Scripture had begun. The testimony of Elias Pike, dated December 1893, remains the most vivid account of that final night. Pike, who survived with burns covering half his body, dictated his statement to a clerk in Granite Falls, his voice reportedly never rising above a whisper. According to Pike's account, the Crow sisters entered the chapel during evening service, carrying what appeared to be a leather-bound ledger, their faces pale as cemetery marble. Pike described how the eldest daughter, Esther, had always been the perfect reflection of her father's piety. She copied his sermons word for word, led the children's prayer circles, and spoke of divine calling with the fervor of a true believer. Yet that night, Pike claimed, something had transformed her into what he called a demon sent from hell itself. She stood before the congregation and began reading names, dates, and details that Pike refused to repeat in full to the clerk. The younger sister, Ruth, had always been the questioner, the one whose eyes seemed to see too much. Pike remembered her as withdrawn during services, present in body but absent in spirit. That November night, however, she stood beside her sister with the confidence of someone who had finally found their purpose. Together, they accused their father of crimes so heinous that the congregation initially responded with stunned silence. Pike's testimony describes the chaos that followed. Reverend Josiah Crow, the man who had guided their souls for 4 years, attempted to seize the ledger from his daughters. In the struggle, someone knocked over an oil lantern. The flame caught the dry timber walls instantly, spreading with supernatural speed across the chapel that had been built entirely from local pine. Pike managed to escape through a side door, but claimed he could hear screaming from inside, voices calling out names of people who had supposedly departed peacefully years before. He swore that as he stumbled toward the lake, he looked back to see the Crow sisters silhouetted against the inferno, still holding that damned ledger, watching their father's kingdom of flesh burn to ash and bone. But to understand the fire, we must go back to the beginning, to the founding of the Chapel of the Sacred Blood and the man who built his throne from the bones of the faithful. Stillwater, Minnesota, was never meant to be found. The settlement existed at the end of a single logging road that wound through 20 miles of dense forest, accessible only to those who knew exactly where to turn. The road itself seemed designed to discourage visitors, rutted and narrow, barely wide enough for a single wagon. During winter months, it became completely impassable, sealing the community off from the outside world like a cork in a bottle. The settlement centered around a natural lake, its waters so dark they reflected nothing but sky. Tall pines pressed close to the shoreline, their branches creating a perpetual twilight even during summer months. The trees grew so thick that sound behaved strangely, voices carrying in whispers, while screams seemed to die just yards from their source. Local indigenous people had called it the Silent Water, claiming the lake swallowed more than just light. Reverend Josiah Crow chose this isolation deliberately when he established his chapel in spring 1889. He brought 17 families with him, believers who had grown dissatisfied with what they called the corruption of modern churches. They built their homes in a careful circle around the chapel, each family within sight of the others, creating what Crow described as a perfect community of faith, where privacy was selfishness and solitude was sin. The chapel itself dominated the settlement, constructed entirely from local timber with a bell tower that rose above even the tallest pines. Crow had designed it himself with unusual features that became apparent only during services. The interior had no windows, forcing congregants to depend entirely on oil lamps for light. The altar stood elevated on a platform that required 7 steps to reach, symbolizing the ascension to heaven. Most peculiar was the basement level, accessible only through a door behind the altar that remained locked, except during what Crow called special communions. Sheriff John Hale of Granite Falls would later describe his difficulty reaching Stillwater during his August 1892 investigation. According to his official report, the logging road had been partially blocked by fallen trees, requiring him to complete the final 5 miles on foot. When he finally reached the settlement, he found a community so unified in their responses that he suspected rehearsal. Every adult gave identical answers about their health, their happiness, and their complete satisfaction with their spiritual leadership. Hale noted the unusual quiet that pervaded Stillwater. Children played in absolute silence, their games consisting mainly of sitting in circles and staring at each other. Adults moved with deliberate slowness, speaking only when directly addressed and then in voices barely above whispers. Even the animals seemed affected, the few chickens and goats appearing listless and docile, beyond normal behavior. The sheriff's report describes his growing unease during his 6-hour visit. Despite the community's apparent prosperity, their food stores adequate and their buildings well maintained, something fundamental felt wrong. He noted that none of the adults would meet his eyes directly, always looking slightly past his shoulder as if focusing on something behind him. When he asked to speak with specific individuals mentioned in his report, he was told they had recently departed for other settlements, though no one could provide specific destinations or dates of departure. Into this sealed world, a king was crowned, Reverend Josiah Crow, whose authority would prove absolute until fire gave his subjects their final communion. Reverend Josiah Crow stood 6 feet tall in an era when most men barely reached 5.5. His presence filled rooms before his voice did, and his voice could fill the largest cathedral without strain. Those who met him described eyes the color of winter ice, pale blue and utterly still, set in a face that seemed carved from marble rather than born from flesh. His hands, which would feature prominently in later testimony, were described as unusually large and steady, capable of delicate work yet strong enough to break bones. Crow had arrived in Minnesota, claiming a divine calling to establish a pure community, free from the contamination of modern church doctrine. He spoke of receiving visions during prayer, revelations that convinced him traditional Christianity had been corrupted by centuries of human interpretation. His version of faith required a more direct relationship with the divine, one that demanded physical sacrifice to achieve spiritual purity. Those who heard him preach described a hypnotic quality to his sermons, words that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to something deeper. Esther Crow, the eldest daughter at 19, embodied everything her father preached about feminine virtue. She wore her dark hair in a severe bun that never allowed a single strand to escape, and her dresses were cut from the plainest fabric available, dyed in colors that seemed designed to avoid attention. Yet despite this deliberate plainness, those who knew her spoke of an intensity that burned beneath her composed exterior. She spent hours each day copying her father's sermons in perfect script, memorizing every word until she could recite them flawlessly. Esther's devotion bordered on obsession. She rose before dawn to pray, spent her afternoons teaching scripture to the settlement's children, and ended each day by reading biblical passages aloud until her voice gave out. Other women in the community viewed her with a mixture of admiration and unease, noting how her eyes would glaze over during particularly fervent prayers, as if she were seeing visions invisible to others. She rarely smiled, and when she did, it never seemed to reach those pale eyes she had inherited from her father. Ruth Crow, 3 years younger, presented a stark contrast to her sister's piety. Where Esther embraced their father's teachings with complete surrender, Ruth questioned everything with a skeptic's persistence that often bordered on defiance. She possessed the same pale eyes as her father and sister, but hers held a restless intelligence that seemed to catalog every inconsistency, every unexplained absence, every whispered conversation that ceased when she entered a room. Ruth's questions began early and never ceased. Why did certain community members disappear without farewell ceremonies? Why did their special communion services occur only when specific individuals had fallen ill? Why did the basement door behind the altar require 3 different locks? Her persistence earned her frequent punishment, hours spent on her knees in prayer or copying biblical passages that emphasized obedience and faith. Yet the punishments never seemed to dim her curiosity, only taught her to be more careful about when and how she asked her questions. Their mother, Agnes Crow, remained a shadow in her husband's kingdom. Once described as beautiful, 4 years in Stillwater had worn her down to something barely substantial. A woman who spoke in whispers and moved through their home like a ghost, afraid of disturbing the living. She had been pregnant twice since arriving at Stillwater, but both pregnancies ended in miscarriages that left her increasingly frail. Agnes spent most of her time in prayer or preparing meals, tasks that required no interaction with her husband's increasingly complex theology. Deacon Malachi Frost served as Crow's physical enforcer, a man whose massive frame and perpetual silence made him more effective than any spoken threat. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with shoulders that barely fit through standard doorways, Frost had joined the community after what Crow described as a spiritual awakening following a logging accident that left his face scarred and his voice permanently damaged. He communicated primarily through gestures and a few dozen words, spoken in a rasp that sounded like grinding stone. Frost's duties extended beyond typical deacon responsibilities. He maintained the settlement's physical security, ensuring that visitors like Sheriff Hale received carefully guided tours that revealed nothing sensitive. He also served as executioner of Crow's justice, administering punishments that ranged from extended isolation to physical discipline that left marks carefully hidden beneath clothing. Most importantly, Frost controlled access to the basement level of the chapel, carrying the keys to those 3 locks on a chain around his neck that never left his body. For years, the system held until the first crack appeared with the ascension of Widow Martha Clay, whose questioning of divine authority would prove fatal in ways no one initially imagined. Widow Martha Clay made the mistake of questioning God's justice during Sunday service in April 1890. She stood up during Reverend Crow's sermon about divine selection, her voice cutting through the chapel's carefully maintained quiet like a blade through silk. She asked why the faithful were required to suffer illness and hardship while their spiritual leaders remained healthy and well-fed. She wondered aloud why certain community members seemed to vanish during their times of greatest need, when Christian charity should have demanded their protection and care. The congregation responded to her questions with the horrified silence typically reserved for witnessing accidents. Children stopped fidgeting in their seats. Adults stared straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge that such blasphemy had been spoken in their sacred space. Only Reverend Crow remained calm, his winter-pale eyes fixed on the widow, with what appeared to be paternal disappointment rather than anger. Crow's response demonstrated the rhetorical skills that had drawn 17 families into the wilderness. He spoke of Job's trials, of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, of the necessity of suffering to achieve spiritual purity. He explained that questioning divine will revealed spiritual weakness, a contamination that required immediate cleansing before it could spread to other members of their perfect community. His words seemed to wrap around Martha Clay like chains, each biblical reference adding weight until she sank back into her seat, visibly diminished. Within a week, Martha Clay fell ill with what Crow diagnosed as a spiritual sickness that manifested through physical symptoms. She developed a persistent cough that kept her neighbors awake through the night, accompanied by a fever that left her bedridden and dependent on others for basic care. Crow announced during the following Sunday service that her illness represented a divine test, an opportunity for the community to demonstrate Christian compassion through what he called a special communion designed specifically for those whose faith required strengthening. The special communion took place on a Thursday evening in the chapel basement, attended only by Crow's inner circle. Martha Clay was carried down the 7 steps by Deacon Frost, too weak from her illness to walk unassisted. According to later testimony, she appeared peaceful, even grateful for the attention, speaking softly about her readiness to accept whatever God required of her. The service lasted approximately 3 hours, after which the participants emerged looking spiritually renewed, speaking of profound religious experiences that had strengthened their faith immeasurably. Martha Clay was never seen alive again. The official announcement of her death came the following Sunday, when Crow informed the congregation that she had achieved a peaceful ascension during the special communion, her soul departing her body at the moment of perfect spiritual clarity. Her earthly remains, he explained, had been consecrated and returned to the earth in a private ceremony attended only by those who had witnessed her final moments of grace. The Stillwater Ledger published a brief obituary noting Martha Clay's sudden passing and ascension to divine grace. The notice emphasized her final expressions of faith and gratitude, describing her death as an example for other community members facing their own spiritual trials. Yet certain details remained unexplained. No one could identify the location of her burial. Her personal possessions disappeared overnight. Most disturbing, the special communion that followed her ascension featured wine with an unusually rich flavor and bread with a texture no one could quite identify. Esther Crow noticed changes in Deacon Frost following Martha Clay's ascension. His movements became more efficient, more purposeful, as if he had discovered a new understanding of his role in the community. He began carrying additional tools on his belt, implements that seemed designed for tasks more complex than typical maintenance work. Most unsettling, he started humming during his duties, a low melody that sounded almost like a hymn, but contained notes that made listeners feel vaguely nauseated. Ruth Crow heard sobbing from the chapel basement on the night following Martha Clay's ascension. The sounds lasted for hours, sometimes rising to wails of despair before dropping back to barely audible whimpers. When she asked her father about the source of the crying, He explained that the basement sometimes retained spiritual echoes from intense religious experiences, vibrations that sensitive individuals might perceive as emotional sounds. He suggested that Ruth's ability to hear these echoes indicated spiritual potential that required careful development. The event was buried beneath layers of spiritual explanation and community pressure, but a seed of dread was planted, one that would fester for 3 years before bearing its terrible fruit in fire and revelation. The letter that brought Sheriff John Hale to Stillwater arrived in July 1892, written by Martha Clay's sister in Granite Falls, who had grown concerned about the widow's prolonged silence. The sister, Elizabeth Morrison, had expected regular correspondence from Martha, particularly during the difficult period following her husband's death. When months passed without word, Morrison contacted local authorities requesting a welfare check on her sister's condition and general well-being. Sheriff Hale initially viewed the request as routine, another family dispute complicated by distance and poor communication. Rural communities often lost touch with outside relatives, particularly religious settlements that viewed secular contact as spiritually dangerous. However, in Bay's case, Morrison's letter contained specific details that elevated her concern above typical family worry. She mentioned Martha's previous letters describing unusual religious practices, extended fasting periods, and community members who had supposedly departed without formal farewells. The journey to Stillwater required careful preparation and consumed an entire day. Hale left Granite Falls before dawn, following logging roads that grew progressively narrower and less maintained as they penetrated deeper into the forest. His horse became increasingly agitated as they approached the settlement, refusing to maintain normal pace and constantly attempting to turn back toward more familiar territory. The final 5 miles required walking after fallen trees, blocked the road in 3 separate locations. Hale's first impression of Stillwater emphasized its otherworldly quiet and the unnatural behavior of its residents. Children played games that involved no laughter or shouting, instead sitting in circles and staring at each other with intense concentration. Adults moved with deliberate slowness, completing their tasks with mechanical precision that suggested careful rehearsal rather than natural behavior. Even domestic animals appeared affected, chickens pecking at the ground without enthusiasm, and goats standing motionless for hours at a time. Reverend Crow greeted the sheriff with warmth that felt calculated rather than genuine, expressing delight at receiving a visitor from the outside world. He explained that Stillwater maintained minimal contact with secular authorities by design, preferring to handle community matters through spiritual guidance and biblical principles. When Hale inquired about Martha Clay, Crow's expression shifted to one of profound sadness, explaining that the widow had departed several months earlier after experiencing a spiritual revelation that called her to missionary work in distant territories. The community's response to questions about Martha Clay demonstrated the unity that had impressed and disturbed Sheriff Hale. Every adult provided identical information about her departure, using similar phrases and exhibiting the same reluctant sadness when discussing her absence. They described her final weeks as a period of intense spiritual growth, culminating in a revelation that required her immediate departure for unspecified missionary duties in locations too distant for regular correspondence. Esther Crow played a crucial role in convincing Sheriff Hale that Martha Clay's disappearance represented spiritual calling rather than foul play. She spoke with the passionate certainty of absolute faith, describing conversations with the widow about her growing desire to serve God in more challenging environments. Esther's testimony included specific details about Martha's preparations for departure, her expressions of gratitude for the community's spiritual guidance, and her excitement about opportunities to spread their particular interpretation of Christian doctrine to those still trapped in secular confusion. Reverend Crowe transformed Sheriff Hale's visit into a sermon opportunity, gathering the entire community for an impromptu evening service that emphasized the difference between secular law and divine justice. He spoke about the challenges faced by faithful communities when outside authorities attempted to apply worldly standards to spiritual matters. His sermon suggested that Sheriff Hale's presence represented a test of their unity, an opportunity to demonstrate their commitment to higher principles that transcended human law. The congregation's response to Crowe's sermon created an atmosphere that made Sheriff Hale increasingly uncomfortable. They sang hymns with unusual harmonies that seemed designed to mask rather than express joy. Their prayers included specific requests for protection from secular interference and guidance in maintaining their spiritual purity despite outside pressure. Most unsettling, they directed their final blessing specifically toward Sheriff Hale, asking God to help him understand the limitations of worldly authority when applied to matters of eternal significance. With the outside world placated through careful performance and unified deception, the Chapel of the Sacred Blood became more isolated than ever, its inner workings hidden beneath layers of spiritual rhetoric and calculated normalcy. The doctrine of sacred blood, as recorded in Reverend Crowe's personal sermon notes, divided humanity into two categories: the chosen vessels who carried divine purity within their flesh, and the contaminated masses whose spiritual weakness made them suitable only for sacrifice. According to Crowe's theology, consumption of consecrated flesh from the spiritually weak would transfer their life essence to the faithful, creating a literal communion that transcended symbolic ritual to achieve actual transformation. Crowe's sermons carefully established the theological foundation for what his inner circle understood as harvest theology. He preached that certain individuals were born to serve as offerings, their life purpose fulfilled only through voluntary surrender of their flesh to strengthen the spiritual community. These chosen sacrifices, he explained, achieved the highest possible spiritual state through their willing participation in communion that transformed their physical being into sacred nourishment for the faithful. The selection process for communion offerings followed specific criteria that Crowe claimed had been revealed through divine visions. Target individuals exhibited spiritual contamination through public questioning of authority, physical weakness that suggested divine disfavor, or social isolation that indicated their separation from the community's collective faith. Most importantly, offerings needed to be chosen from among those whose disappearance could be explained through reasonable spiritual narratives that would satisfy both community members and potential outside investigators. The preparation ritual required extensive psychological conditioning to ensure willing participation from the chosen offerings. Crowe would spend weeks with selected individuals, gradually convincing them that their illnesses or spiritual doubts represented divine communication, requiring special response. He explained that their suffering indicated God's selection for a higher purpose, an opportunity to serve the community through ultimate sacrifice that would ensure their immediate ascension to heavenly reward. During these preparation sessions held in the chapel basement, during evening hours, Crowe would guide selected individuals through intensive prayer and fasting, designed to weaken their physical resistance while strengthening their spiritual acceptance of their role. He described the communion process as painless transformation, emphasizing the honor of being chosen and the eternal gratitude they would receive from community members whose faith would be strengthened through their sacrifice. The actual communion ceremonies took place in the chapel basement, attended only by Crowe's inner circle of 12 adults who had proven their absolute loyalty through previous participation. The basement had been specifically designed for these rituals, featuring stone walls that contained sound and drain systems that facilitated cleanup after ceremonies concluded. Deacon Frost had installed specialized equipment that allowed efficient processing of offerings while maintaining the reverent atmosphere appropriate for sacred rituals. Community members who participated in communion ceremonies reported profound spiritual experiences that strengthened their faith and deepened their commitment to Crow's teachings. They described feelings of divine presence during consumption of consecrated flesh, visions of heavenly approval, and renewed understanding of their role in God's ultimate plan for humanity. These experiences created powerful psychological bonds that made questioning the rituals virtually impossible, even for those who might otherwise feel moral doubts. The communion schedule followed a careful pattern designed to maintain regular spiritual nourishment for the inner circle while avoiding suspicion from the broader community. Crow typically scheduled ceremonies quarterly, timing them to coincide with seasonal changes or significant religious observances that provided natural explanation for special rituals. He maintained detailed records of each ceremony, documenting the spiritual benefits received by participants and the contributions made by each offering to the community's collective purity. Physical evidence of communion ceremonies was carefully disposed of through methods that left no trace for potential investigators. Deacon Frost had developed efficient systems for processing remains, using techniques that ensured complete elimination of identifiable material while preserving the sacred elements needed for communion rituals. Any remaining evidence was scattered across the vast wilderness surrounding Stillwater, returned to the earth in locations that would never be discovered by casual observers. The machine operated with terrifying efficiency for 4 years, its workings hidden beneath layers of spiritual rhetoric and community pressure that made questioning virtually impossible. Regular participants gradually lost their ability to distinguish between divine revelation and human manipulation, their moral compass recalibrated through repeated exposure to ritualized horror disguised as religious transcendence. The system remained stable until it selected a target that Crow's own daughters could not ignore, setting in motion the events that would transform victims into executioners and turn a chapel into a crematorium. Agnes Crow's cough began as a whisper in October 1893, barely noticeable during morning prayers but gradually intensifying until it echoed through their cabin during the quiet hours before dawn. The sound carried a wet quality that suggested something fundamental was breaking down inside her chest, each spasm accompanied by flecks of blood that stained her handkerchief with increasing frequency. She tried to hide the severity of her condition, but in a community where privacy was considered sinful, concealment proved impossible. Reverend Crow's response to his wife's illness demonstrated the cold calculation that had characterized his leadership since founding Stillwater. Rather than expressing husband's concern for his wife's suffering, he spoke of her condition as divine communication, requiring careful interpretation through prayer and spiritual discernment. He gathered the inner circle for special consultations, discussing Agnes's illness in theological terms that emphasized spiritual contamination rather than medical treatment. Esther overheard one of these consultations while cleaning the chapel after evening service. Her father's voice carried clearly through the basement door as he explained to Deacon Frost and the other inner circle members that Agnes's condition represented a test of their commitment to divine will over human attachment. He spoke of her spiritual purity being compromised by years of doubt and questioning, contamination that required cleansing through communion to prevent its spread to other family members. The conversation that shattered Esther's faith occurred 3 days later when she discovered her father and Deacon Frost discussing specific preparations for what they called Agnes's ascension ceremony. Crow spoke with clinical detachment about timing the ritual to coincide with the new moon, when spiritual energies would be most favorable for transformation. He mentioned the need to prepare the basement space for an extended ceremony, one that would require several hours to complete properly. Ruth had been conducting her own investigation, driven by years of accumulated questions that her sister's previous devotion had prevented her from pursuing openly. She discovered the loose floorboard in their father's study through careful observation of his movements, noting how he consistently avoided stepping on one particular section despite the board's location in a natural walking path. Her patient watching revealed his routine of checking this hiding place each evening after the family retired, a ritual that suggested something more valuable than typical household papers. The letter Ruth left for Esther represented a desperate attempt to communicate danger without risking direct confrontation with their father's authority. Hidden between pages of scripture in Esther's personal Bible, the note contained just enough information to convey the threat to their mother's life while avoiding specific details that might implicate Ruth in forbidden investigation. The message, written in Ruth's careful script, read simply, "He has chosen Mother. The cellar is not for preserves. We are the only ones who can stop this." Esther's discovery of the note during her evening Bible reading created a moment of spiritual crisis that would define the rest of her life. Everything she had believed about her father's divine mission suddenly revealed itself as elaborate deception designed to justify unspeakable acts against innocent people. Her perfect faith cracked like glass struck by stone, shattering into fragments that cut her soul with their sharp edges and left her bleeding internally from wounds that would never heal completely. The sisters' midnight meeting in the barn behind their cabin marked the beginning of their transformation, from devoted daughters into determined investigators. Ruth shared the details of her discoveries, describing the hidden implements she had found in the basement, the coded entries in their father's private journals, and the systematic disappearance of community members whose only crime had been questioning divine authority. Esther contributed her own observations, connecting theological discussions she had dismissed as abstract spiritual concepts to their practical applications in ritual murder. Their mother's deteriorating condition provided urgent motivation for action that might otherwise have been delayed by fear or residual loyalty. Agnes had begun experiencing fever dreams that left her calling out names of community members who had supposedly departed for missionary work, her unconscious mind apparently retaining memories that her conscious thoughts had been trained to suppress. The sisters realized that their window for intervention was measured in days rather than weeks or months. The decision to search for concrete evidence represented their final abandonment of childhood faith in favor of adult understanding of evil's true nature. They knew that accusations without proof would result in their own selection for communion, but they also understood that inaction would guarantee their mother's death and their own eventual participation in her consumption. The choice between investigation and resignation forced them to confront the reality that salvation sometimes required sin, and justice sometimes demanded betrayal of family loyalty. With their mother's life hanging in the balance and their own souls already damned by knowledge of truth, they had to find irrefutable proof that would expose their father's machine of flesh and blood before it claimed another victim from their own family. The opportunity for investigation came during Sunday evening service, when Reverend Crow's attention would be completely absorbed by his sermon on spiritual obedience, and the congregation would be focused entirely on his words. Esther volunteered to remain behind after the service to clean the chapel, a duty that would provide legitimate reason for her presence should anyone question her activities. Ruth feigned illness that prevented her attendance, claiming stomach troubles that required rest and isolation, until her condition improved. Esther's role required maintaining normal behavior while creating opportunities for Ruth's investigation of their father's private study. She cleaned the chapel with deliberate slowness, ensuring that her activities would generate enough noise to mask any sounds from their cabin. She also needed to monitor Deacon Frost's location, as his tendency to patrol the settlement during evening hours posed the greatest threat to their clandestine activities. Ruth approached her father's study with the skills developed through years of unauthorized exploration throughout the settlement. She had learned to move silently across creaking floorboards, to manipulate simple locks using improvised tools, and to search through documents without leaving evidence of disturbance. Her investigation of the hidden compartment beneath the loose floorboard required careful excavation to avoid damaging whatever materials her father had concealed. The study's contents revealed the methodical nature of Crow's documentation, with separate journals for different aspects of his leadership. Ruth found theological notes that contained coded references to community members, financial records that tracked resources in ways that made no logical sense, and correspondence with individuals whose names she did not recognize, but whose letters referenced activities that sounded distinctly secular rather than spiritual. Esther's distraction of Deacon Frost required careful timing and convincing performance of innocent inquiry. She approached him with questions about chapel maintenance, specifically requesting his assistance with moving heavy candlesticks that she claimed were too awkward for her to handle alone. Her questions kept him occupied in the chapel sanctuary while Ruth conducted her search, but also provided opportunities to observe his reactions to specific topics and locations within the building. Ruth's discovery of the basement keys represented a breakthrough that terrified her, even as it confirmed her worst suspicions about their father's activities. The keys were hidden in a specially constructed compartment within the desk, secured by a mechanism that required specific sequence of manipulations to open. The compartment also contained detailed diagrams of the basement layout, showing modifications that were not apparent from casual observation of the main chapel area. The basement investigation required courage that Ruth had never needed to summon before, descending into darkness that seemed to swallow her lamp's light and muffle all sound from the world above. The stone walls that she had always assumed were simply practical construction choices revealed themselves as carefully designed features for activities that required containment of sound and efficient cleanup of biological materials. Ruth found evidence of recent use in the basement, including stains on the stone floor that had been scrubbed but not completely eliminated, tools arranged with the precision of surgical instruments and drainage systems that led to locations outside the chapel foundation. The room's design made its purpose unmistakable, even without direct witness to the rituals that had taken place within its walls. The specialized equipment that Deacon Frost had installed demonstrated the mechanical nature of communion ceremonies, with devices designed for restraint, processing, and disposal that transformed religious ritual into industrial operation. Ruth recognized some of the implements from her limited experience with food preparation, but others served purposes that she could only imagine with growing horror and revulsion. Esther's search of their father's desk required methodical examination of every drawer, compartment, and hiding place that his paranoid security might have created. She discovered additional false bottoms, secret panels, and concealed mechanisms that protected documents of varying importance. Her persistence was rewarded when she found a lever hidden beneath the desk's main surface that released a panel she had not detected during visual inspection. The moment when Esther's fingers closed around the leather-bound ledger represented the culmination of their investigation and the beginning of their transformation from seekers of truth to instruments of justice. The weight of the book seemed disproportionate to its physical mass, as if the accumulated secrets within its pages added spiritual gravity that made it difficult to lift from its hiding place. Their successful completion of the search without detection provided them with the evidence they needed to confront their father's crimes, but also committed them to a course of action that would destroy their family and potentially their own lives in the process of seeking justice for his victims. The leather-bound ledger contained 123 pages of meticulously recorded entries, each one documenting what Reverend Crowe euphemistically called spiritual transactions between community members. The entries followed a consistent format: date of selection, name of offering, spiritual justification for choice, ceremony details, and names of communion participants. Reading through the pages revealed 4 years of systematic murder disguised as religious ritual, a mechanical accounting of human lives reduced to ingredients for perverted sacrament. Esther's hands trembled as she deciphered her father's coded system, recognizing names of community members she had believed had departed for missionary work or died from natural illnesses. Martha Clay's entry occupied nearly 2 full pages, detailing her spiritual contamination through questioning of divine authority and describing the purification process that had culminated in her communion ceremony. The clinical language made her death sound like a medical procedure rather than murder. Ruth focused on the ceremony details, trying to understand the mechanical process that transformed living people into sacred nourishment for the faithful. The entries described preparation rituals that psychologically conditioned victims to accept their fate, physical procedures that ensured efficient processing of human flesh, and distribution methods that concealed the true nature of communion elements from unknowing participants. The participants' list included 12 community members who formed Crowe's inner circle, individuals who had demonstrated absolute loyalty through their willingness to consume human flesh in service of their spiritual beliefs. Esther recognized every name, people she had considered spiritual mentors and moral examples, now revealed as accomplices in systematic cannibalism that had claimed dozens of lives over 4 years of operation. Their mother's entry appeared on page 119, dated just 3 days in the future, with preliminary notes about her spiritual contamination through years of questioning and doubt. Crowe had already identified her physical weaknesses as signs of divine disfavor and had begun preliminary conditioning through discussions about her spiritual readiness for transformation. The entry included detailed preparation instructions that made her upcoming murder seem inevitable. Ruth discovered her own name listed among communion participants for ceremonies dating back more than 2 years. The entries indicated her consumption of human flesh during special services she had attended without understanding the true nature of the sacraments being offered. The knowledge that she had unknowingly participated in cannibalism created nausea so intense that she barely managed to avoid vomiting onto the evidence they needed to preserve. Esther found similar entries documenting her own participation in communion ceremonies with additional notes about her spiritual development and her potential for leadership within the inner circle. Her father had been grooming her for increased responsibility in the community's hidden activities, interpreting her devotion as readiness to accept the full truth about their religious practices. The ledger's financial sections revealed the economic motivations underlying Crowe's theological justifications, with detailed accounting of resources obtained through the systematic elimination of community members whose possessions became available for redistribution. Property, livestock, and personal valuables were cataloged and redistributed according to a system that rewarded loyalty while eliminating potential opposition through permanent silence. Correspondence records indicated contact with similar communities in other isolated locations, suggesting that Stillwater represented just one node in a larger network of settlements practicing variations of communion theology. The letters discuss techniques for victim selection, methods for maintaining community secrecy, and strategies for avoiding detection by secular authorities who might investigate disappearances. The most disturbing entries detailed Crow's theological evolution from traditional Christianity toward his current doctrine of sacred consumption. Early pages showed relatively normal religious observations that gradually transformed into increasingly extreme interpretations of biblical passages about sacrifice, communion, and spiritual purification. The progression suggested genuine belief rather than conscious deception, making his crimes more horrifying through their theological sincerity. Medical observations documented throughout the ledger revealed Crow's systematic study of human anatomy and physiology, knowledge he had acquired through practical experience with communion ceremonies. His notes included detailed information about processing techniques, preservation methods, and consumption practices that maximized spiritual benefits while minimizing evidence of criminal activity. The final entries preceding their discovery showed Crow's growing confidence in his theological system and his plans for expanding communion practices to include larger numbers of community members. He envisioned a future where entire families might participate in ceremonial consumption of selected offerings, creating bonds of shared guilt that would make betrayal or escape virtually impossible for any community member. As the sisters absorbed the full scope of their father's crimes, they realized that the ledger represented both their salvation and their damnation. The evidence would expose the truth about Stillwater's hidden activities, but using it would require them to confront their own unknowing complicity in years of systematic murder disguised as religious devotion. The ledger was a death warrant for their father and his accomplices, but implementing justice would require two daughters to transform themselves into instruments of divine retribution in a world where secular law could not reach far enough into the wilderness to protect the innocent from those who claimed to speak for God. The confrontation began during evening service on November 15, 1893, when 37 community members had gathered in the chapel for what Reverend Crow announced as a special communion celebrating the spiritual purification of Agnes Crow. The congregation sat in their usual careful arrangement, inner circle members occupying the front pews, while newer residents remained in the back, unaware that they were witnessing the final service in Stillwater's brief and horrifying history. Esther and Ruth entered through the main chapel doors, carrying the ledger between them, their faces pale but determined as they walked down the central aisle toward the altar where their father stood, preparing communion elements. Their appearance interrupted Crow's reading from Scripture about sacrifice and spiritual obedience, creating a moment of confused silence as the congregation tried to understand why the daughters were not sitting in their designated seats. Esther's voice carried clearly through the chapel as she began reading from the ledger, starting with Martha Clay's entry and continuing through the systematic documentation of 4 years of ritual murder. Her words transformed the sacred space into a courtroom where the accused stood behind his altar while evidence of his crimes echoed off stone walls that had witnessed unspeakable acts disguised as religious ceremony. The congregation's initial response demonstrated their psychological conditioning, with many community members refusing to process the accusations despite clear evidence being presented. They sat in stunned silence, their faces reflecting confusion rather than horror, as if their minds could not reconcile the documented evidence with their years of faithful participation in what they had believed was legitimate religious activity. Reverend Crow's reaction revealed the calculating intelligence that had enabled his crimes, immediately attempting to reframe the confrontation as spiritual warfare between faith and doubt. He spoke of his daughter's contamination by secular thinking, their seduction by evil forces that sought to destroy the pure community they had worked so hard to establish. His voice maintained its hypnotic quality even under accusation, compelling several community members to nod in agreement with his spiritual interpretation of events. Ruth's contribution to the confrontation focused on specific details that made denial impossible, reading aloud the names of communion participants and describing the basement facilities that had been used for processing human flesh. Her accusations created ripples of recognition throughout the congregation as community members began connecting unexplained disappearances with ceremonial meals they had consumed without question. The moment of crisis came when Deacon Frost moved to seize the ledger, his massive frame cutting through the congregation like a ship through water as he advanced toward the sisters. Esther clutched the evidence against her chest, while Ruth positioned herself between her sister and their father's enforcer, creating a protective barrier that forced Frost to choose between restraint and violence in full view of the assembled community. Chaos erupted when several inner circle members simultaneously rose from their seats to support Deacon Frost's attempt to suppress the evidence, while other community members began shouting questions about loved ones whose names had been read from the ledger. The carefully maintained order of chapel services dissolved into pandemonium as years of suppressed doubts and buried questions exploded into open conflict between belief and truth. The lantern that ignited the fire was knocked from its hanging position during the struggle between Esther and Deacon Frost, oil spreading across the wooden floor and igniting instantly when it contacted the chapel's heating system. The flames spread with supernatural speed, as if the dry timber walls had been waiting years for this moment of purification through fire that would consume secrets along with flesh and bone. Esther and Ruth managed to escape through a side door, still carrying the ledger as they fled into the darkness surrounding the chapel. Behind them, the building that had served as both sanctuary and slaughterhouse transformed into a crematorium that would eliminate all evidence of their father's crimes while simultaneously destroying the community that had enabled his activities through willful ignorance and shared complicity. The sisters watched from the forest edge as their father's kingdom burned, flames reaching toward heaven as if carrying the souls of his victims to judgment they had been denied in life. The sound of the chapel bell melting created a warped melody that seemed to express years of suppressed screams from those who had died within those walls, finally free to voice their pain as metals surrendered to heat and transformed into something unrecognizable. As the embers cooled and the immediate danger passed, the story of Stillwater entered its final chapter, but the narrative was far from complete as survivors began creating new versions of truth designed to protect their own interests while burying the horrible reality beneath layers of convenient explanation and bureaucratic efficiency. The official inquest into the Stillwater fire convened in Granite Falls during December 1893, presided over by Judge Hamilton Morrison, who happened to be Martha Clay's brother-in-law and therefore possessed personal interest in reaching conclusions that would not reflect poorly on his family's reputation. The proceedings lasted 3 days and produced a final report that attributed the tragedy to an accidental stove malfunction during evening service, claiming that 37 community members died from smoke inhalation and burns while attempting to escape the rapidly spreading flames. Sheriff Hale's testimony focused on his previous visit to Stillwater, emphasizing the community's apparent normalcy and the reasonable explanations provided for Martha Clay's absence. He described Reverend Crowe as a devoted spiritual leader whose only crime had been excessive isolation from secular authorities, a common characteristic among religious communities seeking to maintain their particular interpretation of Christian doctrine without outside interference. The inquest heard testimony from Elias Pike, the sole survivor found at the scene, whose burns and smoke inhalation had left him barely conscious when rescue workers discovered him near the lakeshore. Pike's account described a normal religious service disrupted by accidental fire, with no mention of confrontation, accusations, or systematic murder. His testimony painted the Crow daughters as heroic figures who died attempting to save their mother from the flames. Official records from the inquest made no reference to human remains, showing evidence of deliberate dismemberment, despite a coroner's note that was apparently misfiled and not entered into the formal proceedings. The note, attached to a burnt bone fragment, identified tool marks consistent with butchering rather than fire damage, suggesting that at least some of the victims had been processed before the fire consumed the evidence. The disappearances of community members over the previous 4 years were explained through testimony claiming that Stillwater served as a way station for missionaries traveling to remote locations where communication was impossible. Witnesses described seeing various individuals departing for evangelical work in distant territories, providing plausible explanations for their failure to maintain contact with relatives in more civilized areas. Property records showed systematic redistribution of assets belonging to supposedly departed community members, but these transactions were characterized as normal community sharing practices, rather than evidence of systematic elimination of inconvenient individuals. The inquest accepted explanations that Reverend Crow had managed these redistributions as spiritual leader, using resources to support remaining community members according to biblical principles of Christian charity. The Crow family's fate remained officially undetermined, with the inquest concluding that Esther and Ruth had perished in the fire while attempting to rescue their mother from the flames. No bodies were recovered that could be definitively identified as the daughters, but this absence was attributed to the fire's intensity and the building's complete structural collapse during the incident. Financial investigations revealed no irregularities in Stillwater's economic activities, with all property transfers and resource distributions appearing to follow legal procedures appropriate for religious communities. The settlement's isolation had prevented routine oversight that might have detected suspicious patterns, but this isolation was characterized as unfortunate circumstance rather than deliberate concealment of criminal activity. The inquest's final report recommended improved communication between isolated communities and local authorities, suggesting regular welfare checks that would prevent future tragedies caused by inadequate emergency response capabilities. These recommendations were never implemented due to budget constraints and the practical difficulties of monitoring remote settlements scattered throughout Minnesota's wilderness areas. Copies of the official report were distributed to relevant agencies and filed in appropriate archives, effectively closing the case while ensuring that future inquiries would find only sanitized accounts of accidental tragedy rather than evidence of systematic murder and cannibalism. The bureaucratic efficiency of this process suggested coordination between multiple agencies to suppress information that might damage public confidence in law enforcement capabilities. Yet one piece of evidence escaped official control when a coroner's assistant retained a single charred page from what appeared to be a record-keeping ledger. The page contained partial entries that seemed to document transactions involving human individuals, but the cryptic language and incomplete information made definitive interpretation impossible without additional context that had been destroyed in the fire. The authorities had successfully closed the book on Stillwater, but the land itself seemed to remember secrets that official reports had tried to bury beneath layers of convenient explanation and bureaucratic denial. The settlement of Stillwater disappeared from official records within 6 months of the fire, its location gradually fading from maps as cartographers found no reason to maintain references to a community that no longer existed. The logging road that had provided access became impassable through neglect, with fallen trees and washouts creating natural barriers that discouraged casual exploration. Nature began its patient work of reclamation, moss covering the foundation stones while saplings pushed through gaps in what had once been carefully maintained buildings. Elias Pike relocated to Granite Falls, where he found work as a stable hand, his burn scars serving as constant reminders of the night that had destroyed his faith along with his community. Pike rarely spoke about Stillwater, but when pressed by curious townspeople, he maintained that the Crow daughters had been possessed by demonic forces that manifested as false accusations against their saintly father. His version of events painted the sisters as instruments of evil who had destroyed a godly community through supernatural malevolence. The remaining loyalists who had escaped the fire scattered throughout Minnesota and surrounding states, carrying with them carefully edited versions of Stillwater's history that portrayed Reverend Crow as a martyred spiritual leader, persecuted by secular authorities and betrayed by his own daughters. These survivors established new communities in isolated locations, adapting Crow's theological innovations to local conditions, while maintaining core beliefs about spiritual purification through sacrifice. Local authorities in Granite Falls actively discouraged discussion of the Stillwater incident, characterizing curiosity about the case as morbid fascination with tragedy that served no constructive purpose. Sheriff Hale retired shortly after the inquest, citing health problems that prevented him from continuing his law enforcement duties. His replacement received specific instructions to redirect inquiries about Stillwater toward officially approved explanations while discouraging detailed investigation of circumstances surrounding the fire. The Crow bloodline officially ended with the fire, as no surviving family members could be located despite extensive searches conducted by both law enforcement and private investigators hired by distant relatives. Property that had belonged to the family reverted to state ownership, eventually being sold to logging companies that harvested the surrounding forest without regard for the settlement's previous existence or the secrets buried beneath decades of accumulated vegetation. Census records for 1894 showed Stillwater as uninhabited, with no mention of the thriving community that had existed just months earlier. Government bureaucracy efficiently erased administrative traces of the settlement, transferring its official existence to historical archives where records would be available to researchers but unlikely to attract casual attention from the general public. The chapel's ruins attracted occasional visitors during the first few years after the fire, mostly family members of victims seeking closure or amateur historians investigating local legends. These visitors reported strange phenomena, including unexplained sounds, unusual temperature variations, and the persistent smell of smoke, despite the complete absence of any fire source in the overgrown clearing. Religious denominations that had been associated with Stillwater's founding moved quickly to distance themselves from any connection to Reverend Crow's theological innovations, characterizing his doctrines as heretical departures from established Christian teachings. Church hierarchies emphasized their lack of oversight responsibility for isolated communities that developed theological positions without proper supervision from established religious authorities. The financial assets that had supported Stillwater's operations were distributed according to legal procedures designed to satisfy creditors while avoiding detailed investigation of how the community had acquired its resources. Properties were liquidated through sheriff's sales that attracted little attention from bidders unfamiliar with the settlement's history, ensuring that most traces of economic activity were absorbed into normal commercial transactions. Professional historians who studied Minnesota's religious communities made occasional reference to Stillwater in academic papers, but typically characterized it as an example of isolation's dangers for small religious groups. These scholarly treatments focused on sociological factors that contributed to the community's failure while avoiding detailed discussion of specific events that had led to its destruction. But erasure is never completely successful, and legends possess remarkable persistence in rural communities where oral traditions preserve stories that official records attempt to suppress or forget. Modern investigators seeking traces of Stillwater's history face significant challenges due to the community's brief existence and the systematic destruction of records following the fire. Amateur historians and paranormal researchers occasionally discover references in local archives or family papers, but these fragmentary clues provide insufficient information for comprehensive reconstruction of events that transpired during the settlement's 4-year existence. Ghost hunters and paranormal investigators report unusual phenomena at the site where Stillwater once stood, including electromagnetic field fluctuations that cannot be attributed to natural causes, unexplained temperature variations that occur in specific patterns, and audio recordings that capture what sound like human voices speaking in whispered conversations. These phenomena typically manifest during evening hours when atmospheric conditions replicate those present during the chapel fire. Internet forums dedicated to Minnesota folklore contain occasional discussions of Stillwater legends, with participants sharing fragmentary information passed down through family stories or discovered in personal documents. These online conversations often focus on reports of cannibalistic religious practices and mysterious disappearances, but lack sufficient historical documentation to distinguish between factual accounts and local legends that have grown through repeated telling. Contemporary cult experts cite Stillwater as a historical precedent for isolated religious communities that develop extreme practices through charismatic leadership and geographical isolation from secular oversight. Academic studies of religious extremism reference the settlement as an example of how theological innovation can evolve into criminal activity when combined with authoritarian control and community isolation from external accountability. Psychological researchers studying group dynamics and social control mechanisms have identified Stillwater-type communities as laboratories for understanding how normal individuals can be conditioned to participate in activities that violate fundamental moral principles. These studies examine the techniques used to overcome natural resistance to cannibalism and murder through gradual desensitization and theological justification. Law enforcement training programs occasionally reference the Stillwater case when discussing challenges posed by isolated religious communities that may be engaged in criminal activity while maintaining facades of legitimate spiritual practice. Training materials emphasize the importance of persistent investigation despite community resistance and the need for coordination between multiple agencies when dealing with crimes that span jurisdictional boundaries. Genealogical researchers searching for information about families who disappeared during the 1890s sometimes discover connections to Stillwater through marriage records, property transactions, or correspondence that mentions the settlement. These researchers typically find that family histories contain unexplained gaps during the relevant time period, suggesting systematic efforts to remove references to connections with the community. Environmental surveys of the former settlement area have identified soil anomalies that may indicate the presence of human remains in locations away from the chapel site, supporting theories that some evidence of criminal activity escaped destruction during the fire. However, these surveys have not resulted in official excavations due to jurisdictional uncertainties and the absence of living family members who might request formal investigation. Archaeological interest in Stillwater remains limited due to the site's remote location and the relatively brief period of occupation, factors that make systematic excavation financially impractical, despite the potential historical significance of artifacts that might be recovered. Academic institutions have shown minimal interest in supporting research projects that would likely generate controversy without providing clear academic benefits. Local real estate agents familiar with the area report that property values in the vicinity of former Stillwater remain depressed due to persistent legends about the settlement's history, suggesting that community memory of traumatic events can influence economic activity decades after the original incidents occurred. The question that haunts modern investigators is whether Esther and Ruth Crowe succeeded in ending a cycle of ritualized murder, or whether they merely eliminated one chapter in a larger story of religious extremism that continues to manifest in isolated communities where charismatic leaders can manipulate vulnerable individuals through theological justification of criminal activity. The single piece of evidence that survived both fire and bureaucratic suppression remains in the archives of the Granite Falls Historical Society, though few researchers have examined it closely enough to recognize its significance. The charred ledger page contains partial entries written in Reverend Crowe's precise handwriting, documenting what appear to be human transactions in language that becomes chilling when understood in context of the allegations that were never officially investigated. One entry remains clearly legible despite fire damage, showing a date in November 1893, followed by a name that has been partially obscured, and concluding with the word offering written in capital letters that seem to burn through the damaged paper. The clinical precision of the handwriting contrasts sharply with the horror implied by the terminology, suggesting systematic documentation of activities that transformed religious ritual into industrial-scale murder. While the motives of the Crowe daughters and their ultimate fate remain lost to history, the physical evidence proves that something monstrous operated within Stillwater's chapel walls during those 4 years when a community disappeared one member at a time. The ledger page stands as testimony to the reality of crimes that official investigations chose to characterize as accidental tragedy, protecting institutional reputations while denying justice to victims whose names were recorded with the same care typically reserved for livestock inventory. The theological justifications that enabled Stillwater's atrocities reflect humanity's capacity for transforming moral revulsion into sacred duty through careful manipulation of religious language and community pressure. Reverend Crowe's sermons demonstrate how biblical passages about sacrifice and communion can be twisted to justify cannibalism, how isolation can be used to eliminate external moral reference points, and how charismatic authority can overcome natural human resistance to participating in systematic murder. The psychological conditioning that converted community members into willing participants in communion rituals reveals the fragility of moral principles when subjected to gradual erosion through repeated exposure to normalized horror. Adults who had lived normal lives before joining Stillwater learned to consume human flesh while believing they were participating in sacred ceremonies, demonstrating how completely individual moral judgment can be subverted by group dynamics and theological manipulation. The failure of secular authorities to detect or prevent Stillwater's crimes illustrates the limitations of law enforcement in protecting isolated communities from charismatic predators who understand how to exploit geographical and social barriers that prevent effective oversight. Sheriff Hale's investigation demonstrated both the challenges faced by rural law enforcement and the ease with which determined criminals can maintain facades of legitimacy when operating in locations where thorough investigation requires resources that small communities cannot provide. The sisters' transformation from faithful daughters into instruments of divine justice represents both the power of truth to overcome indoctrination and the terrible cost of moral awakening when family loyalty conflicts with fundamental human decency. Esther and Ruth Crowe faced choices that no children should confront, forced to choose between preserving their family and protecting innocent lives, ultimately sacrificing everything they had believed about their father, their faith, and their community to prevent further atrocities. Before we close this account, let me ask those of you watching to remember that the most dangerous prisons are built not with iron bars, but with scripture and tradition that silence questions before they can challenge authority. Subscribe if you believe that some truths deserve preservation despite official efforts to bury them beneath convenient explanations. The fire that consumed the Chapel of the Sacred Blood eliminated a building constructed from timber and stone, but it also destroyed something far more significant: a church of flesh that had fed on human lives for 4 years before two sisters found courage to bring a bloody lineage to its end. In doing so, they demonstrated that sometimes the most faithful act is the complete destruction of everything we have been taught to consider sacred, burning it all to ash, so that something clean might eventually grow from ground that has been purified through flame.